I am working on making a 3D printed peg loom that is in segments that you can connect together to make a longer loom. I made one that will fit 5/16 inch dowels, and the one I'm going to use the most is the one that will fit the 1/4 inch dowels. So on the one with the 5/16 inch dowels, those dowels were thick enough that I felt like I could drill a hole without weakening the dowel, so that I could put a little string in there to hold my warp. But on these smaller pegs, I came up with another way to tie on a string for my warp, and I'll show that in just a minute. So all you have to do is just join the segments together, and they slide together. They're a little bit snug, but I tried to make it loose enough to where you could slide them on easily. I did make the stands a little bit more snug in here because I didn't want them to slide off that easily. The first stands I made them really thick, and you can print up whichever one you want, but you really don't need all that. It just takes a lot of time to print. So all you have to do is line up one of these in the middle of two segments like that, and it holds them together, and then you'll need one on each end, obviously. I haven't printed up very many of the small ones, so all I have are these big ones. So when you lift it up, everything should stay together because I made it pretty snug in there. Also, it does keep the loom from tilting. I haven't had too much trouble with this tilting, but it's only 1.5 inches wide, so if you know, it could tilt on you, but these little stands prevent that from happening. The first loom that I tried, I only made it about 1 inch deep, but I found that the pegs bowed a little bit. It was not enough support inside of the loom. So the bottom thickness of the floor, to prevent the pegs from going all the way through, it's only about 3 millimeters. So you're not going to be jamming the pegs in there, so that's plenty thick enough. I cut these pegs 6 inches, but I think on the other loom I cut them 8 inches. So whatever your preference is for how much weaving cloth that you want to weave. I don't tend to want to go very far anyway, so the 6 inch was plenty for me. You are going to lose about 2 inches of weaving width here, or depth, so just cut your pegs to your preferences. So in order to prepare the pegs to hold the warp, what I do is I'll take a peg and I'll take a pencil while the peg is seated all the way in the loom, and I'll just mark. Then I'll take a knife and just cut a groove in there so that the little string that I've put on there won't slide up and down. So I'm going to do that now. You don't have to do that on both sides. I didn't on mine. So what I do is I'll use my loom as a holder, and I'll put this side up so that I can tie a string onto it. So I'll cut a piece of this strong cotton yarn here, about 8 or 10 inches long. And then while it's in the loom here, I'll just tie a square knot really tightly, and I want to make sure that thread is landing, or that yarn is landing in my little groove, and try to make the groove wide enough. And so I'm pulling it tight so it'll seat down inside that groove, and tie it really tight. And I'll come back with some glue in that groove right there. I'll put a dab of glue to keep that yarn seated in there. So while I have it in here, I'm going to take another one of these pegs to help me measure, because I want to create a little loop that my warp is going to go through. So I'll just use a dowel or anything that you need to measure to make it a big enough hole for your yarn. So, and I'm using the stand to help me to hold that up. So first I'll just get it started. Make sure I'm still in the camera and that my hands aren't in the way. I'll just get my little loop started. And then I'll put this peg in there to measure it and tie it tight. And that way all of your loops will all be uniform if you use the same measuring. And I'm going to do one more knot. You don't want a really big knot there because when we advance our warp, this knot's going to get hung up on the yarn. So if you tie it really tight with some really tiny thread, not too thick of a cotton warp, then that'll work just fine. I'm going to trim that off, and then I'm going to slide my measuring, the one I used to measure with, and slide that out. And then I'm going to put a little fray check or glue, whatever you want to do, on the knots, because this cotton thread tends to want to fray a little bit. So put a good bit of the fray check on there and let that dry. And then again, you want to add a little bit of glue where the thread sits into that little groove. And so these will sit, I don't want to let that one dry, but these sit in here like this with this short side down. And your warp is tied to that little loop. And usually you're going to measure out your length and double it so that it can be a doubled warp most of the time. I think that if you tried to tie a single one on here, you'd end up with a knot that is going to be hard to pull through. So most of the time you're going to have a doubled warp. There's a lot of videos on YouTube showing how to use Peg Loom, so I don't want to go into that. But this one works very well, and because I've made it so deep, I don't have any problem with bowing, even if I pull my work my weft just a little bit too tight. It still, still hasn't given me any problem. So I'm pleased with this so far. And these videos will explain to you, there's so many of them online, how long to cut your warp threads and how to do the weaving and all of that. I did design a dowel. It doesn't print very well without supports. I printed one with supports and it came out better, but it's really rough because you have to sand off all those supports, and that's more work than I want to do. So I tried it without support and I printed it flat on the 3D printer, and it's really smooth without sanding it. And I've got, I think that's an 1/8 inch hole in there, and it's pretty good. But I think I'm going to prefer the wooden dowels. And all you'd have to do on this one is tie your string in there. So it's your option of whether you want to print these up or not. But it does come out okay without support.